Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Andy Piper, and I'm VP of Engineering at DiffBlue, and I'm here to talk to you about Agile Agency, which is really just a catchy title to try and attract the conference organizers. So really, this is all about people, and in particular, again, clicker problems, in particular about trusting people. So this is a quote from Stephen Covey: "Trust is the glue of life. It's the most essential ingredient in effective communication. It's the foundational principle that holds all relationships." And so I'm going to talk a lot about trust and people trusting people. So first off, a little summary of what we're going to talk about. So first off, I'm just going to talk about engineering process, or at least how I kind of understand engineering process. I run a team of about 30 engineers. I think we do things pretty well, or I like to think so, and just sort of analyze some of the things that make that process good or bad. Next, I'm going to talk a little bit about some theory, and in theory, in particular, theory around motivation, what makes people tick, why do they do the things they do, in particular in relationship to work. And then something about my favorite book at the moment, Turn the Ship Around, which one of the other speakers has also referenced. I'm not going to steal that thunder. I'll talk about that later. And then finally, just sort of wrapping this all up, how do we do this at DiffBlue? So just some practical guidelines about what worked for us. May not work for you, might work for you, just some thoughts to get you going. Okay, so a little bit about me. Although I'm a manager now, have been for a while, I am technical as well. I have quite a background in technology. I originally started on distributed systems, did a PhD at Cambridge on MapReduce, and then I worked for BEA for a while. I don't know whether everybody remembers BEA, Bill, Ed, and Alfred, long gone now. And I worked on WebLogic Server, both in the US and here, and was sort of one of the architects of its sort of networking protocols, clustering, high availability, that sort of thing. I then switched to the world of real-time data streaming, primarily at Oracle, a bit at BEA, but primarily at Oracle, and ran their event server products. And then got a bit bored of big company process and not getting stuff done, and shifted to a very small company, Push Technology, now call themselves Diffusion Data, but I was CTO there for a while, and they had a real-time data streaming middleware product. So I sort of ran technology for that. And then I switched back to big company, CBRE, which is actually the biggest, the largest global real estate company in the world, $14 billion. And was an interesting time, but encountered the same sort of problems I encountered at Oracle, which was not able to get anything done. And so here I am back at DiffBlue, which is sort of a smallish company. We're about 50 people, 30 of those are engineering. And we have a product that writes unit tests in Java using AI. I'm not giving a talk about that this year, but if you're interested, I got some links at the end. Okay, so on with the show. So what is Agile Agency about? At least this is my definition. If I'll return to this theme several times, so you probably won't, you better not forget it. But Agile Agency is about control, about competence, and about clarity. Control, competence, and clarity. And I'll dig into these later, so sort of stay tuned. And in summary, this is because staff want to be empowered, they want empowerment, they want agency, but they need a framework in which to do that safely. This is why we don't just sort of let people go and have free-for-alls. And so this is sort of the thesis of my talk, and I'm going to dig into each one of these pieces in a little bit more detail. So first, a counterexample. So I think Steve Jobs is the counterexample, at least the way Steve Jobs ran Apple. Great guy, great company. I'm not going to say whether he's right or wrong, but he did things a little differently to the way I see things working. And there's actually a great blog here if you're interested about sort of how he operated. I know some of this is sort of folklore now, but there is a blog that sort of details some of this stuff. And he had the habit of doing micromanagement, so it was very top-down driven, very much telling people what to do, very much he withheld context a lot of the time, so people didn't know why they were doing things. They were just said, told you should go and work on this. And some of that was for good business reasons, because they didn't want to let information leak. And Apple was notorious for leaking at the time, so did it for reasons. It had a mechanism of charming people and then immediately humiliating them afterwards. And this sort of achieved good output from them. And then a lot of the decision making was all top down. So, Steve made the decisions at the top and it just all sort of trickled down. So that is a way of doing things. And of course, Apple was massively successful. So you can't say that he didn't get something right. But I don't really want to live like that. I don't want to work for a company that operates like that. And I don't think you have to achieve the same sort of excellence. Obviously, this is one way, but I'm going to present another way. So that's my counterexample. Enough of that. So this is our CEO, Matthew Lodge, and he says, Diff Blue is made of people who are extremely passionate, care deeply about the mission, put customers first and get stuff done without unnecessary drama. And there's a real emphasis on without unnecessary drama here. So that's kind of our cultural statement, if you will, for the company, and sort of reflects a different attitude to how to go about achieving great things in our case. So let's talk a little bit about engineering. So I did have some pretty rubbish images from Google on this, and then our graphic designer came along and made them all much, much better, so I'm much happier with these slides. So I think you can consider engineering a bit like a sausage factory. And what are the key elements of a sausage factory? So the engineering sausage factory. And we've sort of talked, there's been other talks that have touched on this. Sven in his talk talked about queuing theory and how you get sort of rapid throughput in terms of doing things. And this very much relates to doing repeatable engineering. So the first thing to recognize is that engineering is a continuous process. It's not boom or bust. I think sometimes people have a sort of boom or bust attitude to engineering. We're going to heroically pull an all-nighter, we'll get the thing done. And the problem with that is that everybody then collapses in a heap afterwards, and your sort of productivity goes up and down like this. And what I keep telling my team is we've got to have sustainable cadence. It's got to be cadence that we can keep up again and again and again and again, because customers don't stop asking for features, bosses don't stop asking for more stuff to be done. The process has to be continuous, and it has to be done in a way that people want to do it, they want to stay, and also that they have fun doing it as well. So sustainable cadence is very much my motto in terms of running my team. And one of the ways that you get sustainable cadence is through muscle memory. So I think this is one of the things that perhaps is overlooked about Agile sometimes, is that experience of the process is really, really important. If you're doing something and it's always new, then you sort of have that little bit of friction every time you try and do something. So muscle memory, knowing what the process is, it's sort of the team mentality. When you look at a rugby team, everybody knows their place on the pitch, they know who's doing what, they know who's passing to who. It's that kind of team-based muscle memory that's really important to drive efficiency in teams. So another thing about sausage factories is you need to provide high-quality ingredients. So it's no use putting in garbage, garbage in, garbage out. We know that phrase very well. So in the case of engineering, this is high-quality groomed tickets, if you're doing Agile, which we are, going into the sprint. And I'm sure we've all sort of encountered those sorts of issues where that is not the case, and then things just kind of slow down because there's people don't know what they're doing. And then finally, you need to have some sort of feedback process. How do you know what's going on? How do you make improvements? How do you get better at doing this sustainable cadence? And so this sort of operational efficiency can be measured in different ways, and there's obviously lots of metrics. I'm not really going to get into the metrics, but metrics are a good way. You can't improve what you can't measure effectively. So you've got to measure stuff, and then you can improve on that. And the other thing is to look at how it affects customers. So, obviously when you're building products, we're building product, There is an ultimate consumer, and if you're not looking at how the consumer is consuming your product, if you're not getting that feedback into the engineering team, then you could be doing the wrong things in the wrong way and just not having the impact that you could have. Okay, so that's this is how we hit deadlines. So if you've got sustainable cadence, you can do the things again and again in a repeatable way, and that's how you can hit deadlines. So how can you break this process? Well, the first thing is poor quality ingredients. I had a friend who used to run a Walker's crisp factory, and they managed to drop a glass test tube or something like that into the production line, and the whole thing had to stop for several days. They had to clean the whole thing out. So just a small amount of poor quality ingredients can bring everything to a grinding halt, and engineering is exactly the same. If you have poor input, particularly product input, and poor quality tickets, then things just go slower. You get engineering doesn't understand what they're supposed to be doing. Product thinks engineering is doing the wrong thing. You just get a lot of this kind of friction due to poor quality input. Change. Change is quite a problem when you're looking for sustainable cadence. Everybody's experienced change here, I'm sure, and in particular, changing people. So teams change, people join, people leave, management changes, whether to leave the company or manage different teams. Companies change. I mean, I've been part of a couple of company acquisitions, and it never sort of carries on quite the way you expect it. There's always some friction there. So changing what you're doing, and in particular changing the people who are doing it, provide friction to the process. Sometimes it's necessary, but you just got to recognize that change brings these problems with it. Dirt in the component parts. So this is where things are not operating as smoothly as they might. And tooling plays a part here, but for the most part, I think this is all about people. So when people work well together, when you have strong team cohesion, then things can operate very, very smoothly. But where you have teams, individuals within teams that are not operating well, and in particular, sort of toxic team members, I've sort of come across this a couple of times in my career, where one very, very toxic individual can basically just destroy an entire team. Like it doesn't take much. It's a bit like dropping red ink into water. It just spreads through the whole system. So lack of team cohesion, lack of problem solving. Agile is all about teams taking responsibility for delivery. If they're not working well together, they simply can't do that. Manual intervention. Everybody loves to crash a sprint. Product managers love to crash sprints. Oh, we're going to heroically do this other thing for this customer. It sounds nice in theory. I've never seen it work well, I have to say. I've never seen it work well. I mean, you eventually get what you were asked for, but it's usually not in the time frame that you or the product manager was expecting. And generally, people are pretty miserable after it. I've seen people just utterly exhausted after some sort of sprint crash, all-nighter sort of thing. And so it always looks like an attractive thing to get the deal, to get the customer across the line, but generally it doesn't work like that in practice. And I think with a lot of things, you've got to actually look at the data, look at what is working. It's no good having a sort of theoretical notion of, well, if we do this, this will happen. You've got to look at what actually happens when you take certain actions. And then finally, just a timely input and output. So I think this is mostly relating to planning. And obviously, Agile is much more of a sort of just-in-time planning process related to waterfall. And if you do Agile, you know that it's easy to do too much planning. I mean, waterfall is too much planning, and you can end up building the wrong thing. But it's also possible to do too little planning. And we constantly struggle with this in our teams. How do we make sure that we do enough planning to have a smooth sprint, but not so much that we're kind of planning 3 weeks in advance, in which point you might have to just throw away all the planning because something changes. So just getting that timeliness right, particularly around planning, is really important. So if you don't do these things, that leads to lack of drama, and this is kind of what Diff Blue is all about, like reducing the drama of the process. Drama's nice once in a while, but generally people just want to head down and get on with their job. So there's a bit of a dilemma here, because if you remember, I said change is a problem. Like change produces friction, change slows things down. But Agile implies change. Like change is sort of part of the process. You're trying to respond, you're trying to micro-pivot based on customer feedback. So how do you make that work? How do you make the changing world of Agile operate efficiently? So one of the things you do in Agile is responding quickly to changing requirements. You're also trying to counter problems early so that you can sort of micro-pivot around them. And then, of course, the sort of primary value of Agile is trying to deliver value early, always trying to deliver sprint by sprint so that you can do something slightly different the next time around and align priorities. So it's not possible to just say, okay, this is what we're going to do for the next 6 months, let's get on with it, which is the kind of non-change environment. You can't get the value out of the process if you do that. And of course, Agile is all about process improvement as well. You do kind of ceremonies, all these sorts of things, retrospectives, all of that is about trying to make the process better, which again implies change. Okay, so back to Agile agency. So if you remember, Agile agency is control, competence, and clarity. You don't have to know what these mean just yet, just remember the words, okay? So I will come to the words in a little bit. So just to kind of emphasize what I've been talking about, staff want to be empowered, they need a framework to do that safely, but they also need to be able to do it efficiently. So how do you tie all of these things together? So to sort of consider this problem a little bit more, I'm going to take a little bit of a theoretical interlude. And if you like theory, then buckle up. If you don't, go to sleep, have a coffee or whatever. It won't take very long. So this kind of problem, sort of how you sort of get people to operate smoothly has been analyzed for quite a long time. And there's sort of two views of the world. There's the Hobbes view of the world. Hobbes was a researcher. And this basically says people are lazy and self-interested and need to be controlled. And this is kind of where Ford was going with his sort of, you're basically sort of breaking tasks down, you're taking away their agency, controlling them to get the result you're interested in. And basically you're saying people can't be trusted. Can't trust people to do the job I need them to do. And then there's the Rousseau, again, researcher Rousseau, view of the world, which says people are generous and creative. So people are, they're not lazy and self-interested. They're generous and creative, but it's the context around them. It's society that makes the outcomes bad, essentially. And there was, I watched a film recently, and the main character was asked, he went to Harvard, said, say something smart. You went to Harvard, say something smart. And they said, well, Hobbes is Rousseau through a dark mirror. And I kind of understood that joke. We would have just kind of disappeared over my head before doing this talk. But having done this talk, I kind of understood it afterwards. So that's kind of theory. MBAs love to look at these sorts of things. I actually have an MBA as well as all of the technical stuff, a long time ago now. So what is the MBA? Well, if you hired in your management consultant, what would they say about people on this in this context? Well, on the kind of controlling people side, they basically say, well, people are basically bad. And this is what's called Theory X. And this is the idea of scientific management. So again, Ford, production lines, those sorts of things. And basically the idea is that you break tasks down to reduce the skill required in order to deliver outcomes. And this gives you predictability, gives you control, gives you assembly lines, and it works. I mean, Ford was massively successful, worked really, really well. But it wasn't empowering, didn't trust people very much. So there's also Theory Y. I mean, MBAs aren't very good at thinking up interesting names, but it's called Theory Y. There's actually a Theory Z as well, but I'm not going to get into that. So Theory Y is neo-human relations. And again, this is basically assuming people are good. And this is where Maslow's hierarchy of needs comes in. I'm sure some of you will have heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And basically this says that you've got to provide people's basic needs before they can be expected to do sort of higher level things. So basic needs are things which he refers to as hygiene factors. So basically got to have a roof over their head, they've got to have money, they've got to have food on the table. And at the top of his hierarchy of needs is what is called self-actualization. So this is where people achieve the best version of themselves. Can they achieve what they what they are able to achieve? And of course, on the bad side, the scientific management side of the equation, they can't at all, right? Someone else is just telling you what to do. So that's not achieving what your vision of yourself is. So whereas self-actualization is about autonomy, and with that goes job enrichment and satisfaction. So this is kind of people are bad, people are good. So which is agile? Are people good or are people bad? And our graphic designer had a lot of fun with this. Oh, it's not this slide, it's the next one. This is just a reminder. Agile agency is control, competence, and clarity. So staff want to be empowered. So they want to be trusted. They want to be treated as good people who will do the right thing. They want to have agency. But they need a framework to do this safely and efficiently. So this is kind of, you want to have processes, you want to have control around what's going on so it doesn't go totally wrong. So Agile is both. I can see, I like the little, you can see the little Spock on Diff. So I should say the owl is DiffBlue's logo. So we have an owl called Diffie. This is why the owl is appearing in all of these slides. That's our company logo. So people are good and bad. Surprise, surprise. I mean, no shit Sherlock, as you might say. So how do we do that? How do we provide empowerment to people and teams and also provide a framework? So another quote, this comes from Simon Sinek. A team is not a group of people that work together. A team is a group of people that trust each other. And so it's all about trust. This is how you can provide both control and empowerment. And this is where we get on to control, competence, and clarity. So these words come from my favorite book, Turn the Ship Around. So this is written by an ex-now US nuclear submarine captain. So he used to, he ran this submarine called the USS Santa Fe, and it was a bit of a disaster. So he sort of inherited this posting. It's a pretty big deal. I think there's 300 people, 300 crew on a nuclear submarine. It's about $4 billion worth of kit, so it's quite a big responsibility. But his team just hated it. They made mistakes all the time. No one was getting promoted. There was a big staff turnover, but basically because they couldn't see any future. There was no way they could sort of make more progress. And they were even trying to follow impossible orders. So, you can imagine in sort of command and control situations, the captain says, do X, and the crew will try and do X, even if X is not physically or logically possible. They just get on and try and do it. And they sort of encountered this a number of times. So he inherited these problems, and the book is essentially about how he solved them. It's a great read, loads of chapters of a few pages each. So, you can read one at bedtime every night and you'll quickly get through it. I thoroughly recommend it, very clearly written. So he characterized the problem as leading in a culture of followers. So people were just following his lead. They weren't taking responsibility. And that was what was leading to the problems. And at least that was how he characterized it. And how did he address this? So he developed a new culture based on mutual trust. So it's not about just trusting people, it's about people trusting you as well as a leader. And the way he did this is he emphasized these three aspects. So competence. So competence is knowing what we're doing based on training and experience. You can imagine if I went into a nuclear submarine, I wouldn't have a clue. So you wouldn't hire me to be a crew member on a nuclear submarine. I have no competence. So competence is necessary when you're trying to get something done. It's no use having people who don't know what they're doing. So that was one of the things he fixed, was competence. Also, control. So this is not about controlling people, it's about giving people control. So giving them ownership, giving them empowerment. And so a lot of what he did was devolve responsibility down to his crew members. So rather than saying, you do this, he would give them the option and they would present they would say, Captain, I'm about to do such and such, and he would say, very well, or whatever. So it was about getting people under him to take responsibility for that. First of all, figure out what they were going to do, and then take responsibility for doing it. And then finally, clarity, which is about vision, essentially. So knowing where we're going and why we're doing things. So one of the problems with the kind of following impossible orders is if you don't have context, you don't have an underlying understanding of what is actually trying to be achieved, it's impossible to make good decisions. And so this is what clarity is about, having clear vision about the direction you're traveling in and why you're traveling in that direction. And I see this all the time in my teams. If my teams do not have clarity about why we're doing something, it's very, very hard to motivate them for a start, because they think, well, why are we doing this stupid thing? But also, they can't make good decisions. You know, they have to ask questions all the time. Well, should I do it like this, or should I do it like this? They can't make any sort of decision if they don't have clarity about the why and the where they're going. And David Marquet characterizes this as leader-leader, not leader-follower. So it's basically turning your staff into leaders and giving responsibility, devolved responsibility to the team. And I actually had an interesting experience of this just trying to give this talk. So I have given this talk before. I gave it in DevOps Belgium last year. And I've basically been watching myself on repeat just to try and remind myself of what I was saying. And it's actually really hard. If you just try and follow what someone else has done, I find it really hard to do a good job. Whereas when I sort of was taking more responsibility, I'm not saying I'm not doing a good job now, but it was really hard that when you're just trying to follow what someone else is saying, you actually end up delivering a sort of an inferior experience. And so it just, sort of was a microcosm emphasizing to me about how important this really is. So this is how we meet deadlines. This is how we meet deadlines through trust. And if you trust people, if you have leader-leader, if you devolve responsibility down, then it's easy, right? So deadlines get hard when you're trying to control people, especially if you're trying to control people several layers down. This is where sort of delays in communication come in. Whereas if you trust people, they can make local decisions, and local decisions are generally fast. So we're always being asked for more features. We can never deliver enough. We can never deliver enough quickly enough. So we're always being asked to go faster, to deliver more. And if you're sort of trying to control each little part of the conversation, each little part of the delivery, that's a great way of going slower. So it results in poor communication, poor motivation as well, because people they're not being trusted to get on with their jobs, and very long cycle times. And missed deadlines are often a symptom of inefficient top-down control. And localized decision-making is fast and efficient. And in the MBA view, there's lots of research papers about this as well. They talk about the people at the coalface. They're the people who know, but they're also the people who generally have a lot of context to make good decisions quickly. And that's what you want, especially in Agile, especially in software development. All right, so that's engineering, theory, turn the ship around. So what did we do at DiffBlue? How have we encouraged leader-leader? And we're on a journey. We're not done. Still more to be done. There's still more to tweaks. It was interesting. I can't remember, 6 months since I gave this talk. So I was reviewing where we've got to in those 6 months. And actually, we've changed relatively little. It's all the same sorts of things. We've just done a lot of tweaking. So I was sort of quite encouraged by that we seem to be, still be able to put these things into practice. And I think one of the good sort of metrics is whether people leave or not. So people leave if they're not, obviously they leave for hygiene reasons as well. If you come to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you don't pay them enough, all the rest of it. But generally people leave if they're not enjoying what they're doing, they don't feel it's worth it, and they don't feel they have sort of control, empowerment over their own lives. So if you have very high staff turnover, it's good to ask why that is. And we've had pretty low staff turnover in that time, which has been really great. Okay, so what did we do? So I'm going to treat each of these in turn. So first of all, competence. So one of my other favorite books, I did used to have a picture of it here, but it's not here anymore, is Good to Great by Jim Collins. Anybody read that? Yeah, a few. So he, well worth reading, but one of the things he really emphasizes is about having the right people on the bus. So competence, being able to do something well, is much easier to achieve with the right people. And often getting the right people is about hiring the right people. And it's really important as a company to assess whether the people you have are able to do the thing you're trying to do. Like, is there a mismatch between those two things? And at Diff Blue, quite early on, we did that analysis. We did gap analysis of what are the skills we've got, what are we actually trying to achieve. And although everybody was highly skilled, some of the skills were not what we needed. And some of the skills that we did need were completely missing. And so we had to make some staff changes to sort of plug those holes. So very important to get the right people on the bus. And the other thing is, it's very important to use people's strengths. So, everybody, I'm sure people have had experience of doing a job that they hate. Often you hate something because you're not very good at it, and it's just boring. And leveraging people's strengths is a great way of motivating people and getting things done well. So if you've got the right people doing the right things, then you can achieve things much more quickly with higher degrees of competence. And at Diff Blue, we made a number of changes where people were in certain roles, but we also recognized their strengths and kind of said, well, actually, if you were doing this, I think actually you might enjoy that a lot more. And it was true. They enjoyed it a lot more. We got a lot more out of them. And we were able to just shuffle things around a little bit to leverage people's strengths. This applies sort of negatively as well. Sometimes people have weaknesses, and you sort of want to not put them in a position where those constantly get leveraged. And we sort of did. Sometimes you get managers who should really be technical staff, or technical staff should really be managers. That's sort of one of the ones I've seen quite a lot. More difficult with sort of technical skills, because I think technology can be learned a bit more like that. And then the other thing to remember is competence requires experience and muscle memory. So I particularly see this in managers. So I like to call this the sort of the MBA effect. So I've in my career, I've come across several times highly skilled technical people. They do an MBA, they come back and say, right, I know everything about management, let me at it. And that's a great way to make a lot of mistakes, because management is vocational. Yes, there's some theory around it, but it takes experience as well. You got to understand what works and what doesn't work. And this is about kind of experience and muscle memory. So where we lacked experience, we hired it in. And in our particular case, we didn't have a lot of enterprise Java experience, but we were selling to enterprise Java type customers, so we needed to sort of hire in that experience. And also we wrote down and practiced our processes. So this is sort of where Agile really excels, I think. So you sort of want to get into this sustainable cadence where people know what you're doing. We run 2-week sprints. People know when the refinement is. They know when the demos are. All those sorts of things. They know what's expected of them, when it happens, how long it's going to be, and they just get very, very comfortable with doing those things really efficiently. And to start with, it was a bit of a disaster. We had sort of refinement meetings that just took hours, and no one could agree on anything. And what we didn't want to do is we wanted to sort of keep forcing a time frame on people so that they were forced to choose and forced to make decisions, rather than just sort of letting them talk for hours and hours and hours. And gradually, over time, as we did it more and more, people got more comfortable both with the time frame they were operating in and the questions they were being asked to solve. And then the other thing we did was not change too quickly. So obviously, you do want to do process improvement, but there are certain changes that can be quite disruptive. And so, for instance, whole team kind of changes can be very, very disruptive. So I think sometimes you've got to change quickly. Like when I joined Diff Blue, we had to make very large changes, but it's much better to do those all in one go, so people then are kind of sort of more relaxed going forward. If you keep changing things quite a lot all the time, people get very uncomfortable and think, oh, what's going to happen next? And some people like to run teams that way. I'm not one of them. I don't think people generally like to operate in that fashion. Okay, so control, or how do we give people control at DiffBlue? This slide was based on another book I love, The Lean Startup, although I can't exactly remember why. So the Lean Startup, if you have not read it, is all about building the right product rather than building the product right. And often engineering teams can have a focus on building the product right and are still building the wrong product, and that's kind of a disaster. This is why people are very on for product market fit. So in terms of giving people control, ironically, this kind of starts at the top. You've got to have leaders who are comfortable with devolving responsibility. And so it starts with me, it starts with my boss, the CEO. If the leaders are not prepared to sort of give up control to their staff, then you're never going to get started. So it's really important to understand that it's got to start. It doesn't really work grassroots. I had someone who came to me in my other talk, said, oh, I'm in this engineering group, how do I make them do this stuff? And it's very difficult. You can't do it bottom up. You got to have people who are at the top who understand that this is the right way to do things. And those leaders need to emphasize autonomy and provide opportunities for independent thought. So one of the things we're keen at doing at DiffBlue is not asking for options. So engineers are great at providing options. You say, I want to do X, and you say, oh, you can do this 20 different ways. Which one do you want to do? I'm sure you've all had that experience. So what we tend to say is, no, have an informed opinion. What do you think we should be doing? Tell us. And it's just forcing people to take responsibility, because actually, when people are taking responsibility, when they're saying, oh, well, you've got to pick the option, then they think a little bit harder about it. Whereas if they just say, here's all the things you could do, at that point they've abdicated responsibility. There's nothing on them. If it all goes wrong, they just say, oh, you picked the wrong one. I did say you could do these other things. Whereas if you force them to have an informed opinion, they take a little bit more responsibility. And then there's this need for structured communication. There was a great talk I went to earlier in the day about remote teams, and he was emphasizing structured communication in particular. So Slack, not a great tool for structured communication. It's a great tool for sort of synchronous interaction, but if you want to sort of reach consensus, especially if you've got remote people, if you want to reach some sort of consensus about things, doing things, then writing it down in a structured way is really, really important. I mean, I'm not talking about War and Peace and back to the sort of waterfall methods, but writing stuff down just so people can orient around a written document, really important, because otherwise it's all based on word of mouth. He said this, she said that, oh, didn't you hear that X, Y, Z's happening? It's all very, very nebulous. So write stuff down. Obviously, Slack's a good tool as well for using communication, but I had one thing where someone in my team was putting links to Slack conversations in Jira tickets, like this is the recording of what we were going to do, and I said, no, don't do that. It's so lazy, and of course, it disappears after a while anyway. And then the other thing from an engineering perspective is it requires product buy-in. So obviously there's this interaction between product management and engineering, and products have got to be comfortable as well with devolving to responsibility, because making decisions is not just technical decisions, it's about what you're going to do as well as the way you're going to do it in. And product needs to be comfortable with that. Otherwise, they will, again, try and micromanage the product down to the nth degree, and that generally doesn't result in good outcomes. And the way to make them comfortable is to be competent. So it's to prove that you can do things well again and again and again. And if you do that, then product get much more comfortable with taking a higher level view and pushing some of the details down into the engineering teams. But to do that, you've got to provide sufficient context and sufficient opportunity to do it, and you've got to communicate effectively. So we went through a couple of iterations where product was sort of throwing stuff over the wall, and engineering would sort of mull and then deliver the wrong thing, and product would say, well, that's not what I wanted, and engineering would say, well, you didn't provide us enough information. And you have to communicate, you have to have this back and forth to reach the consensus of what you're actually trying to do. It's no use just kind of saying, here you go, get on with it. So effective communication. And then clarity. Clarity is all about vision. So one of the things we're lucky about at Diff Blue is our CEO has a product background. So he was a product manager, he ran product for a software company. And because of that, he recognizes that it's all about value delivery to customers. And so value delivery and feedback are the ways that we get clarity within the company, and our CEO is able to provide that because he's very used to building a picture of, this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it, because this is how it affects customers. So having that sort of leadership that is able to provide that context is very, very useful, very, very important. We still get it wrong. It's still easy to lose vision and strategy, especially when time ticks on, or you have staff changes. We've noticed this a little bit as well. So we reach a sort of agreed vision and strategy, roll forward 6 months, and some of the people involved have changed, and then you suddenly realize that they weren't part of that original discussion. So again, a reason for having structured communication and writing things down. And then finally, we use OKRs. Sometimes they get a bit bad press, but we find them quite useful for just setting high-level strategy, like this is what we want to achieve, giving people context, and then they can operate within that framework. And then another thing about clarity is that it requires that you do your job. So one of the things we found that can be problematic is when people don't trust each other, they end up trying to do each other's jobs as well. And that's a great way to have a disaster. Because if you try and do someone else's job, typically you don't have the competence to do that. Often you don't have the context. And so, chaos ensues. So it's important that you do your job, and it's important that you don't do someone else's job. And then the other thing that you want for clarity is focus and questioning. So we're talking all the time, particularly between product and engineering. We're always questioning what we're doing, why we're doing it, back and forth, how we're doing it, giving product context around the art of the possible, product giving engineering context around what customers are asking for. And so it's very important that this is a sort of dynamic process where you've got good focus and good questioning. So I'm coming into land here. So in summary, then, engineering can be rough or smooth, but it's how you do it that's really, really important. And people are the key. So I'm sure everybody recognizes that here, but if you don't sort of address the people aspect, you can have all the processes you like in the world and still have disaster. You've got to have the right people working on the right thing with a high degree of autonomy and trust. And then at Diff Blue, we've made some mistakes, but I think our product, our culture, our customers sort of speak volumes about the way that we do things. If you want to know more about us, a little pitch here. So we do have this tool called Diff Blue Cover, which is an AI tool for writing Java unit tests based off your programs. Someone was bad-mouthing it yesterday. I don't think they're here, but it actually writes really good tests. I was a little offended, I have to say. So it's an AI tool. It's supposed to be, it writes tests in the way that a developer would. So we're not sort of about reams of hard-to-read generated code, both as an IntelliJ plugin and as a CLI. So please scan, you can get a free trial if you scan the link there. And that is it. So I've got 7 minutes for questions, if anyone has any questions. Question here.
I'll just read you back. Yeah, so you did mention you didn't want to touch on metrics much. You did mention one around maybe staff turnover, but there's quite a lot of material in the tech leadership space around what metrics you should or shouldn't use. The wrong metrics create distrust.
Yeah.
Actually have the opposite effect. All that sort of stuff. Some should be kept just within teams. Some should be seen by the people engineering. That sort of stuff. So what do you do for the teams?
Yeah, good question. We use a lot of metrics, I have to say, so I don't want to give the impression that we don't use metrics. I just wasn't going to really cover them. We use all the usual ones, so we do use story points, we do use velocity, that sort of thing. Um, I think a lot of the time with metrics, it's important to give the context to people, like, we're using this to achieve this outcome. And so, I mean, the typical one is story points are not days. That's the typical sort of thing, and we sort of emphasize that a lot. But I think if people have the right context around what it's measuring and how it's used, then it's less likely to offend people, essentially, which I think is the sort of basis of your question. We also use a lot of homegrown metrics, I have to say. So I've got a guy who works for me who's great with data, and he loves visualizing it, and we keep trying to sort of visualize different metrics to tell us something about how things are going. And I think one of the important things here is what is the outcome you're trying to achieve? Like, it's very easy to get focused on metrics for metrics' sake, but actually they should be based on an outcome. So it's always important to focus on the outcome first, and then sort of roll that back into the metric that you're measuring. So, for instance, we use the DORA metrics as well, just to sort of explore those sorts of things. But we also do things like sometimes we use metrics to try and drive certain kinds of behavior. So one of the things I really hate is people picking up large stories at the end of the sprint and then carrying them over. And that breeds a mentality of not finishing stuff. And so, and that sort of then has this roll on where, the engineers kind of say, oh, I'm done with my job, it's all QA's job, the sprint is done. And actually that's not really the heart of Agile. You want teams to take responsibility for what they're delivering. And so we started trying to use metrics which look at tickets that were picked up that weren't planned for in the sprint, that were both finished and not finished. And we sort of put those in little graphs to sort of just provide that context of, okay, you picked this ticket up, you did finish it, great. You used the capacity in your sprint to achieve a good outcome, and you still finished the sprint. Or you picked up this big ticket, it's carried over, now what are we supposed to do with it? So just, we play with metrics quite a lot that way. Well, I could give a whole talk on metrics, so big question. Other questions?
Yeah, I'm wondering how flexible this framework is. Suppose there's a team that wants to Scrum but Kanban. Is that like other boundaries about what's kind of autonomy?
Yeah, I think this is sort of process agnostic to some degree. I mean, I've used Agile in this because I think there are some, Agile is kind of what most people do these days, and there are some challenges with how you sort of make that work effectively. I mean, Kanban is the canonical sausage factory. You just got a board and you just keep moving things through. I think one of the things I don't like about Kanban is that it doesn't give people deadlines, and so people have a tendency to then drift, and that can be bad for people. It's not very motivating. So even if we have people doing Kanban, we tend to still demarcate it with sprints. So for instance, we have a DevOps team. Sometimes a lot of their stuff is often Kanban driven. It's like, we don't need it for this customer, this sprint. But I still say to my managers, get them to commit to something. I want them to do that process of commitment, trying to get something done, because there's a couple of individuals who sometimes, if left to their own devices, will just kind of go away and do something forever. So I think this can work in any context, but having that sort of cadence actually helps in a lot of ways, even if you're not doing Agile. Other questions?
Yeah, in terms of when you mentioned empowering and also giving a framework
Yeah.
to the team members, that include as well, for example, tools that they need to use during the work, or are the teams completely independent in terms of the tools they can use to do things? You can choose
So the question was, is giving people tools part of the sort of empowerment framework, I think, roughly. Really great question, because it's kind of a yes or no answer, right? So as a technologist, people usually often say, oh, I just want to use the best tool for the job. But as a manager, you're thinking, okay, so you're going to use Go rather than Java. That gives me a headache in terms of hiring. What happens if these people leave? So one of the ways around that is to provide context, like, this is why we're doing everything in Java. This is why we're not using these particular tools. So there need to be some standards, I think, to get the sort of, operational efficiency that you're looking for. But at the same time, I don't want tools to stand in the way. So for instance, laptops is a great one. I've worked for companies where they have strict budget limits around laptops, around renewing laptops, and it's such a false economy. We had one, like for instance, when M1 came out, it made a massive difference to compile times, and given how much people cost, it makes complete sense to just get them a new laptop. If they need a new laptop, get them a new laptop. So I think, yeah, so it's a kind of yes or no answer. I'm sitting on the fence a little bit there, but hopefully that answers your question a little. And my time is done, I'm afraid, so I'll take questions afterwards, but thank you all for your time.